While everyone waits to see what is happening with the US consumer in the aftermath of the events of the past couple months, we're starting to get some data trickling in. The US government reported softer than hoped for consumer spending for the month of April. Plus, we got a report out of Texas that suggests in May there may be an even bigger stumble ahead. As part of the Dallas Fed's services sector survey, what they reported for specifically the retail trade was pretty eye opening. Retail sales activity contracted sharply in May, according to business executives responding to the Texas Retail Outlook survey. The sales index, a key measure of state retail activity, plunged 33 points to minus 30.5, its lowest level since April of 2020. Retailers' inventories pushed further negative, no surprise there, with the May index falling to minus 10 from minus 2.4. Plus, retail sector labor market indicators suggested continued contraction in employment and work weeks. Not a good sign there. The employment index remained at minus 8.1, indicating a decline in employment. And given the level of indicated sales that the report showed, it's no wonder that businesses down in Texas would be cutting back on employment. Now, the question that we have is, first of all, this survey was for the month of May, not April, which means after the trade delays and all the positive announcements and developments, they pick up in the stock market. So the question that we have is Texas just an outlier here, or is it giving us some insight and a warning into what may be sweeping the rest of the national marketplace? Are consumers getting to the point where they saw stock market rebound, some trade deals, and said, that really doesn't change everything? If trade wars didn't break it, then trade delays aren't necessarily going to fix it. So let's bring in Steve here. Steve, Mr. Van Meter, I know you looked at the Texas report too. In fact, you're the one that sent it to me, so you know all the details here. What's your take on this? Is Texas being Texas, some kind of unique situation, or are there commonalities in Texas that we should look at and find in other places around the country?
Yeah, Jeff, I think this is definitely something that's going to spread rapidly across the country. And we're going to start seeing this in a lot of surveys, because I look at this and I think, is this really about the trade war, or is this just really what was eventually coming because the U.S. economy was already slowing here? So I do know, of course, we front run the tariffs a lot. There was a lot of demand, but Jeff, what I'm struggling with, it didn't really pick up in economic activity. Yeah, we saw hours work jump, but we didn't see a bunch of people get hired. We didn't see a lot of spending pass through. In fact, we saw just the opposite. We're finding out today that personal spending's dropping. And then we looked at Texas and say, wow, that was really devastating here. And of course, we know there's a lot of knock-on effects from this. Employers are still saying we're not really cutting a lot. And we heard that in Texas. We're trimming a little bit, but not a lot. It's the hours that's going to still have the same effect. You don't have to fire someone. You take an hour or two off of their work week. Well, it's going to have a big impact on the rest of the economy.
That's what consumers have been saying. I mean, Jay Powell in the mainstream, they keep downplaying consumer sentiment as saying, okay, yeah, everybody's pessimistic, but it hasn't translated into actual depression in economic activity. And we're saying is it already did even before we got to the tariffs and the trade wars in April and May. You just pointed out consumer spending numbers from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the monthly figures. We also got the GDP numbers we can talk about too, the downgrade in personal spending during the first quarter. And what the monthly figures suggested in the month of April before we get to May, not surprisingly, the consumers took a step back after a big splurge in March when everybody went out and bought automobiles, fearing the prices of cars are going to go zooming way ahead due to tariffs. But it wasn't just, March and then April. April was kind of weak. As you know, Steve, spending in January and February were in fact, spending in January in real terms was highly negative. And then according to the latest updated figures, it was modestly negative, fractionally negative in February. So we started out this year with real personal consumption expenditures negative 2 months in a row. Then you had the one-time surge in automobiles that carried over a little bit into April. But even overall, with that little carryover, there wasn't much spending in April. And now that people down in Texas are saying everybody slammed shut their wallets, is Powell right? I mean, you have to ask. I mean, he keeps saying it's consumer sentiment is consumer sentiment. It's not happening in the real economy. But we get more and more indications that if it's not as bad as consumer sentiment has fallen, let's be honest, consumer sentiment is apocalyptic in some of these surveys. It's probably not that bad in the real economy, but it doesn't have to be. What we're seeing is that there is corroboration in these real economic accounts that suggests consumers are doing something, even if it's not the worst case scenario.
Yeah, Jeff, and that's what's in the thought about the data today that I found very interesting is we got the personal savings rate because yes, we have surveys and we have all these anecdotal things, but the question is if consumers are indeed pulling back on their spending, are they doing the opposite reaction and saying, look, we're really concerned about our financial future? The response is we're going to save money. And what did we see? Personal savings rate, I believe it ticked up 4.9%. So yes, consumers are responding in kind here. And I think, Jeff, a lot of this is people are saying, look, I'm cutting back, and they're talking to friends and family and coworkers, and they're finding out everybody is cutting back. Everybody's saving more. And we could say, well, maybe some of this has to do with the fact that maybe they want to buy a new car, but they can't really afford it. So they're going to save money, and in a couple of years, they're going to buy one. I don't think that's what it has to do with anything. I think they're going to work. Everybody's cutting their spending. They're looking at the new order book. They're seeing, wow, that thing's way down. So the boss says, go work on backlogs. And those are shrinking at a rapid pace now. And the reality for a lot of workers here is there is going to be no work. And that's why we're seeing the savings rate go up, in my opinion.
Yeah, so we had consumer sentiment that really fell off sharply in April, of course, because a lot of consumer sentiment is tied to the stock market. The stock market comes back in May, so sentiment picks up a little bit. But I don't know what your take on this, Steve, is. Consumer sentiment, like the University of Michigan survey, that one got really pessimistic, really dark and negative. It didn't really come all that back. It didn't come back all that much in May either. Still really low, which is kind of consistent with what we're hearing from Texas. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that, as we keep saying here, spending consumers were not in a good place even starting this year. Let's talk about GDP, for example. The GDP revisions to the first quarter, so the second set of numbers for the first quarter GDP, they raised the contraction a little bit from -3%, 0.3% to -0.2%. But the big revision was they took a big chunk out of consumer spending and put it into inventory. So they said we sold, actually, I mean, it wasn't all that great to begin with. We sold a lot less than we thought in the first quarter, and a lot more went into inventory. In fact, it was a massive amount, over 163 billion in real terms, something we haven't seen since the fourth quarter of 2021 and the first quarter of 2022, back when the world was struggling to get goods and get their hands on anything because of the supply chain difficulties. This isn't supply chain difficulties. This is totally front running. And so consumers are already cutting back and spending. And as Steve said, the savings rate picking up validates what we're seeing in the consumer surveys, because the consumer surveys say consumers are worried about their jobs. They can see everything that Steve just mentioned. So they're pulling back and spending. That's already happening. That's not a future thing. And they're doing so, increasing their savings rate to give them a little bit more cushion, not because they want to buy something in the future, as Steve just said, but because they're afraid this economy is going in the wrong direction, and they're preparing for it. It's not just negative consumer sentiment. There's already evidence of activity, changes of behavior in the economy that just leads to more of the same types of things. And eventually it almost becomes, one of those self-fulfilling prophecies.
Yeah, Jeff, and this was a key point here is consumers aren't just talking saying, look, we're pessimistic. They're starting to act like it. And that's a dangerous sign in a consumption-based economy, because at the end of the day, as long as people keep consuming, that's what we need to happen. The moment the U.S. consumer backs off, and that's what we're seeing right now, it's game over. And when you talk about this inventory level, this is fascinating because we can go back to the pandemic, and we erased all notions that there would be an inventory recession. And then what did we do? We started a trade war. We built up these massive amounts of inventory, and everyone's still saying, look, we can't see disinflation. We probably won't see deflation. But the reality is consumers are responding right now, and they're saying, look, we don't even afford prices at today's level. Forget what prices are going to go to. We're cutting our spending now. And all these businesses that says, hey, look, we got to get in here and make manufacture and buy all this stuff at current prices so we can mark it up at tariff price and make some more money, are finding out that they're going to sit on older and older inventory. And it's setting up for deflation. Now, it will be broad-based, of course, Jeff. We know that certain prices are going to go up and stay up, but yet there's going to be some inventory clearing at some point. So we come back to the survey. You kind of mentioned that, hey, we saw a pop here. I kind of think back to kind of going into the election when the economy was clearly slowing down, and yet what do we see from University of Michigan? Hey, it's going up, and the stock market would go up, and then it would go up some more. I think this pop maybe had something to do with the stock market, Jeff, but I think the other factor is a lot of people believe, and they want to believe, they have to believe, that if the trade war ends, the economy goes back to normal, and it happens immediately. I don't think that's the case, But I think that's what we're seeing in the sentiment surveys is as their deals appear to happen, consumers are getting like excited because it means maybe they don't lose their job. I think it's game over either way here.
Well, it literally can't, right, Steve? The economy can't go back to the way it was because of the tariff distortions that we already have, right? I mean, we just talked about the epic amount of inventory. The other side of that is imports. Imports absolutely soared in the first quarter by an enormous amount. And then the data that came out this week showed that imports crashed in April by a record amount. So even though that's going to be GDP positive, that's going to be really negative for economies around the rest of the world who spent the last couple of months building and moving and shipping stuff and manufacturing and assembling everything to get it ready to go to the United States. And then all of a sudden, like hitting a wall, all of that stops. So you already have inventory distortions, production distortions, supply chain distortions all up and down the line. We can't go back to the way it was before, even if we wanted to. So all of these economies having pushed forward all of that demand or pulled forward all that demand to the fourth quarter of last year and first quarter of this year, no matter what happens from here, they have this gigantic air pocket sitting in front of them. And that's not just, it's a bigger deal for foreign economies than it is, say, for domestic producers. But domestic producers are going to have the same problem. And we're seeing this problem actually show up more and more in the service sector, which a lot of it is tied to the goods sector too. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, as we keep saying, spending in the first quarter was incredibly weak. And just to give you a sense of what I mean here, after the revisions to the second set of revisions to first quarter GDP and personal spending, the PCE rate fell down to, was pulled back down to 1.2%. 1.2% is incredibly low. If you go back to the 40 quarters of the 2010s, there were only 6 quarters out of those 40 that were lower than 1.2%. And then you add the 2020s on top. Out of the 60 quarters, excluding the pandemic quarters, only 8 out of 60 quarters has personal spending been less than 1.2%. That's how weak consumer spending was going into it. And so you have all of these businesses that say, we got a massive distortion. We got this huge overhang in inventory that we were hoping to be able to sell off at a decent pace moving forward, knowing that it was going to be difficult anyway. As it turns out, the selling environment, the consumer demand environment was even worse than feared going into it. And it's not getting better on this side of the trade delays. That's the Texas data. I mean, they have to be thinking, oh, crap, what do we do now? We've got all of this stuff. We've got nobody to sell it to. We got to tell all the producers, that's it. Stop. We can't take any more stuff. So everything has to really, if not shut down, it has to slow down to a big degree.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. And that's why I think we're going to start to see at the manufacturing level in particular, you're going to see hours getting slashed. I mean, they don't want to lay off. And a lot of manufacturing, you do see unionized employees. So they're not going to lose their jobs right away, but you're going to see hours just get cut and the overtime is going to go away. And that spending is going to backfeed into the economy. So you mentioned earlier, what about the Fed? Of course, we don't believe in the monetary magic of interest rate policy. But it seems to me, Jeff, we saw a 2, 5, and 7-year note auction this week with really strong demand. And yet, what do we keep hearing? There's trade uncertainty, in the markets, but there's even more uncertainty at the Fed. It seems like they just absolutely no idea what they need to do, and they're going to stand pat. And again, if everyone believed in the magic, and maybe that's what the economy needs right now, maybe there is really no answer for the direction we're headed. But, if the Fed came out and cut rates, maybe people would actually go on and spend. Who really knows? But the problem is, I think they're behind the curve. 100% they're behind the curve, but that's just what they always end up doing here. And again, we comes back to the consumers. They're seeing their finances worst level since 2009. Should be a wake-up call to the Fed because they're saying, look, I'm worried about my job, but now I'm backing it up with less spending. It's going to lead to, of course, hours cut, jobs lost, and then the downward spiral until it's too late.
Yeah, the market keeps saying that. It doesn't matter what the Fed thinks, that conditions in the real economy are for lower interest rates. That's what the 2-year is. In fact, the 2-year this week moved down to the lower end of its recent range. Last couple of weeks it's been hanging around 4%. Now we're talking about down 393 in that territory. It gets down below 390 into 380s. That suggests that the market is again rethinking the re-risking that's going on in the stock market and saying the fundamentals don't argue for something like the stock market. Trade deals are going to fix everything. And instead, the marketplace, as you mentioned, Steve, heavy demand for treasury paper in the middle of the curve, which is consistent with the same signals, is that everybody's piling into safety and liquidity, anticipating at some point the Federal Reserve is going to get its shit together. They're going to stop looking at tariffs being inflationary and say, we see the other side of this. In fact, the Fed says this already. They say, look, we're worried about tariffs becoming inflationary, but we do see some softening in the labor market. And I do want to get your opinion, Steve, on jobless claims. That's another thing that comes in, suggesting that there's weakness in the labor market already. Jobless claims pop to the highest level since 2021. And it looks like they're starting to rise and elevate here. And even initial claims are picking up a bit too in places like Michigan. That's, auto business. And we know the auto business is struggling. But the market is saying the Federal Reserve is going to do what the Federal Reserve is going to do. But eventually, over time, all of these things are going to matter more than the Fed's theories on inflation. And it's no wonder why. When you start out this year with consumer spending weaker than anybody anticipated, weaker than everybody seems to appreciate, and then you get these forward indications past the trade delays and on into May, where consumer confidence that was nasty didn't really come back. You got the Texas retail survey that says everybody in Texas just stopped spending, even though, all the trade delays. You get all these indications, put them together, and the market is really saying at some point, Jay Powell's got to get his head out of his butt and start to realize that there's no inflation risk. And oh, by the way, the latest inflation numbers or consumer price numbers from the government are incredibly tame, show there's no inflationary pressures from tariffs too. Steve, it's not one thing or another. It's basically everything everywhere.
Jeff, I think the Fed wants to cut. I think they're worried about it. And I'm going to tell you why.
You got to tell us, what is your theory about why they're not doing it?
Because, the Fed has theories. I got theories. And my theory is that Powell knows he needs to cut. They have this average inflation targeting or whatever this BS thing they came up with, but we know what it means. It's simple. Hey, if inflation's going up, but the labor market unwinds, they already know ahead of time. Look, you don't get inflation under those conditions. And I think that's what they're going to be worried about because, again, what you said, the PCEs hit right toward the Fed's 2% target. Yet they're saying we can't cut because it might go up. So this is a problem for them. So they know they're going to need some excuse because they've latched on. And we talked about if they latch on to this inflation thing for too long, they're going to get stuck with it. So they got this average inflation targeting, meaning if the unemployment rate or something in the labor market goes, it gives them the latitude, the excuse to cut. I think they're going to be worried about that. I think we're going to hear that at the next FOMC meeting because, yeah, you're right. Initial claims ticked up a little, continued claims ticked up a little, but nothing that really says like, oh my God, it's here. I think when we get, of course, the weekly hours, I think that's my big red flag. The next thing we're going to see is a big drop in that. Then we start to see the layoffs. I think employers hold on for a little bit here, Jeff. I'm not sure how much longer, but I think they're going to try to hold out. But I think the Fed way behind the curve. I think Powell's going to want to cut, and I think we're going to hear about the labor market the next meeting.
Yeah, I think we're going to hear a lot about it because that's what consumers continue to say. That's what all the data continues to say is that no matter how much that employers really do want to hold on and hope for the best here, it's just not happening. And even after we get through all of the rebound in stocks in April or into May and some of the re-risking credit markets that have gone along with it, it's just not being followed through. You look in places like oil, for example, oil prices are just struggling. That's a real economy signal. That's not entirely about supply as much as it is about demand, where the oil market is saying, we're with these consumer spending figures. It's just not happening. So you've got consumers aren't just pessimistic, they're already altering their behavior. So the question that I asked at the beginning of the show is how much? Is it something like that we see in the Texas retail survey? I mean, I hope not, because that would be really catastrophic. So let's hope that Texas is an outlier, but understanding that even if it is, it's not as much of an outlier as we might like, because there's so much corroborating evidence all over the economy that the downside isn't some theoretical future thing to worry about, as the markets have been saying. It is actually here right now, and it is showing up in too many places.
Yeah, that's right, Jeff, because you look at this from a business perspective. They've been asked to do two things. One, absorb the tariffs. Number two, hold on to employees. You can have one, but not both.